Okay, a very warm welcome to Campion Hall, Oxford, for the fourth of the Father Martin Darcy Memorial Lectures 2021. The Darcy Lectures are offered in collaboration with Georgetown University Press. My name is Wilin Buitrago. I am a doctoral student in politics here at Campion Hall, and I would like to welcome all those in Oxford who are joining us, especially those participating in the Common Good project in the Faculty of Law. I would also like to welcome those in the Georgetown University, and wherever you are joining us from, you are very welcome. As you know, this year, the title of the 8 lectures is Common Good, Theological, Philosophical, Political Access by the Revd Dr Patrick Riordan, Senior Fellow in Political Philosophy and Catholic Social Teaching at Campion Hall. Last week, Patrick introduced us to the discussion about liberalism. This week's lectures is entitled The Role of Conflict in a Political Account of Common Goods. There will be time towards the end of our hour together for questions and remarks unanswered. So during the talk, please do post your questions in the Q&A section. And I will now handle it to you, Patrick, so you can start the session.
Thank you, Will. Good evening, all. In 1997, there was just one Darcy lecture, followed by a series of 4 seminars at Campion Hall. The Darcy lecturer that year was the famous French scholar of literature, René Girard. His topic was victims, violence, and Christianity. I'm not going to recall his famous mimetic theory of desire and associated analysis of the scapegoating mechanism. If you're interested in that, I can recommend the work of my colleague, Michael Kerwin, who is professor at Loyola Institute in Trinity College in Dublin. What I am interested in is what Girard formulated as the political question par excellence. The question about our world, he said, is not really why so much violence, but why so little? Why are we not always at each other's throats? This is the question that motivates this lecture, but reformulated in my terms. How do we succeed when on rare occasions we actually do succeed in managing our conflicts such that they do not erupt in violence? How do we institutionalize the peaceful and peace-endorsing handling of conflict? I'm sure no one will deny the reality of violence and the violent handling of conflict, not even those who argue that cooperation is an adaptive strategy that has been reinforced in the evolution of humankind. In his lecture, Girard, who has his own analysis of the sources of conflict in mimetic desire, finds echoes of his position on the origins of conflict in the account given by the great English political philosopher, Thomas Hobbes. But when it comes to proposing a solution, Girard finds Hobbes unconvincing. You must have a master, Hobbes says, and this master human beings choose together among themselves in a friendly and amicable way. In order to stop their fighting, they must get together and form a government. But they do it at the very moment when they should be incapable of doing it, when the crisis is most intense, when the violence should run to extremes. Girard's question then begins with the reality of violent conflict and inquires how we have learned to manage conflict. Part of the answer that I will propose is that we humans have learned and continue to learn to do politics, to be political, and in such a way that we do not discount the reality and pervasiveness of conflict, conflict that at any time could erupt into violence and have us at each other's throats. But that short answer provokes a number of further questions. What is politics? How does politics differ from rule or from government? Can Aristotle's account of politics be reconciled with the reality of politics in the 21st century? Is Catholic social teaching adequate to the reality of conflict and of politics today? So I begin with the short question, what is politics? And to this blunt question, I offer a succinct, summary answer that requires further elaboration. Politics is one way of managing social conflict. In taking this line, I follow Bernard Crick's In Defense of Politics, which offers a revision of Aristotle's approach. Politics is by no means the only way of dealing with conflict, and it may not even appear to be the most effective way. Conflict arises because the goals pursued by different people are mutually frustrating or incompatible. Conflict is socially significant when the number of people involved is large, typically when the goals pursued by different groups or classes or parties are mutually incompatible. Independence for Scotland is incompatible with the survival of the United Kingdom as we now know it. Home rule for Ireland at the beginning of the 20th century was incompatible with the maintenance of the United Kingdom ruled from Westminster. A united Ireland is incompatible with the continued existence of Northern Ireland as part of the United Kingdom. Brexit is incompatible with a customs union between these islands. Conflict can be managed by one group or party succeeding in imposing its will on the other groups by coercing them. This can occur through the actual use of or the threat of violence. This is what I mean by force, the use or threat of violence. Coercion is the effect of force. However, experience shows that this is not an enduring or stable way to manage conflict. I remind you again that I understand conflict in terms of incompatible goals, for instance, nationalization or privatization. And that is to be distinguished from disagreement, which has to do with incompatible propositions. Disagreement does not always entail conflict, but conflict always presupposes disagreement. The management of conflict is political when it renounces a primary reliance on coercion and attempts to achieve conciliation through negotiation, argument, and persuasion. Most typically, political management of conflict occurs within a territory which enjoys a form of rule. Normally today we speak of a territory with its own form of rule as a state, or perhaps a sovereign state, or even nation state. The key to politics, however, is not primarily the form of the state institutions, but the reliance on talking and persuasion to achieve some accommodation between conflicted parties. The common use of the English word politics is of the way in which interest groups compete for power within a state so as to pursue their interests as effectively as possible. The struggle for power is the core of this common usage of politics. Accordingly, the conflict element is carried over in the colloquial usage, but the reliance on non-violent means for managing conflict is not incorporated in the usual definition. For the purposes of analysis and argument, it is important to have some way of distinguishing between the handling of conflict which relies on talking or negotiation and the handling of conflict which relies on force. I attempt to maintain this distinction by stressing that only some forms of state rule are political. Now, that goes against our ordinary everyday usage of the term of politics, but for analysis it's important. There are many forms of rule which either A, deny the reality and inevitability of conflict, and or B, attempt to eliminate or resolve conflict by force. Of course, the importance of the distinction does not entail that there can be a complete separation of these elements. Max Weber rightly emphasizes that a state must claim a monopoly on the justified use of coercive force within its territory. Note that the emphasis is not on the actual use of force, but on claiming a monopoly on the justified use of force. Even a state that always succeeded in handling conflict by negotiation and never actually had to use force would still have to claim the monopoly of legitimate use of force and have the resources at its disposal to make this effective. And this claim would on occasion be invoked in practice when individuals or groups within the state attempted to achieve their interests by force at the expense of others or of the good of all. Weber's definition picks out an unavoidable feature of a state, but does not claim to be exhaustive in its explanation of the state. The political management of conflict will usually involve compromise. Not every party to a conflict can achieve the realization of all its goals. Otherwise, there would not have been a conflict in the first place. This is one reason to speak of managing and handling instead of resolving conflict. Conflict persists, but the achievement of politics is that the conflict is conducted by talking rather than with the use of force. Only where there is a willingness on all sides to forego some of their objectives can political accommodation be reached. It is not surprising if weaker parties are prepared to compromise. The willingness of an economically and militarily stronger party to enter into a compromise for the sake of a peaceful settlement is not to be presupposed. Of course, the practice of politics requires considerable skill, and a culture committed to managing its conflicts by political means will devote resources to cultivating those skills. Beyond skills are virtues, qualities of moral character, whereby even the stronger, more powerful personalities have learned to constrain their desire to win and to get their own way. They restrain themselves in the name of fairness, justice, the common good, and the value of politics itself. Conflict is understood in terms of incompatible goals. Goals are to be distinguished from ideals and values. A goal is a state of affairs which one hopes to bring about. For instance, free healthcare at the point of delivery, or living wage legislation. The state of affairs is capable of being described in all relevant features. By contrast, ideals or values, such as justice or peace or compassion, can be invoked to make sense of one's motivation for wanting to bring about the quality of health care envisaged. Of themselves, the ideals or values are not capable of such precise description as is the case with goals. Notoriously, people on opposite sides of a conflict can claim justice or peace or similar values to make sense of their position. Litigants who go to court hope to get justice. But until the court has decided the issue, parties in dispute presume that justice in the case lies with them. The point here is not to affirm that courts always succeed in doing justice. There are too many examples of blatant miscarriages of justice to make that case. Rather, the point is that the appeal to justice alone does not provide common ground. Conflict is not resolved simply by parties in dispute espousing values and ideals such as justice or even care for our common home. The language of values and ideals is aspirational, and it is not necessarily helpful for managing conflict. In fact, it can hinder the political dealing with conflict because an apparent agreement at the level of ideals may obscure the real differences of interests in what is proposed. For instance, those who advocate the nationalization of the banks are opposed by free market proponents, but both sides make their case in terms of what is conducive to the good of the economy or to the common good. Reference to the values of the public welfare or the common good does not decide the issue in favor of one or other goal. A different impression is given by the literature that I've cited in earlier lectures, which regards the common good as sufficiently specific to delineate an alternative to the object of criticism, as Sandel's writing of the common good as if it were an alternative to meritocracy. Much more, of course, would need to be said. Similarly, with Mark Carney's book on values, appealing for a re-embracing of values in public discourse, I endorse all that he says about the need to espouse values, but the hard work remains of working out what goals we can agree on to implement those values. The values themselves do not give a positive indication, but they can help us clarify what is unacceptable. As well as the distinction between values and goals, the distinction between means and goals is also relevant, and it allows a further distinction between the technical and the practical. The practical has to do with our goals, while the technical concentrates on means. Curiously, many of those who hold power in public office often prefer to see politics as a technical matter. Candidates present themselves to electorates as technicians with the necessary competence to implement the measures which are means to the assumed goals. Get Brexit done. The goals are assumed to be agreed and are typically presented in non-controversial language. Full employment, social welfare, education, protect the NHS, healthcare security. However, the assumption of agreement glosses over the real conflicts between incompatible goals. So the language of ideals and values short circuits the process. Since all are assumed to want justice, peace, and prosperity, it appears that the only issue remaining is to decide on the means to be adopted to bring them about. And that issue reverts to the question of which professionals are most skilled in the selection and operation of means, and so best placed to deliver the desired goals. Some of those who theorize about politics reinforce this view that it is ultimately not a practical matter, not about divergent goals, but a technical matter about implementing the right means. Plato's vision of the philosopher king is one example, giving priority to the mastery of the knowledge whereby the city could be guided to good order, without allowing for the possibility that there might be validly diverging views about what would constitute good order. Curiously, nationalists, Republicans, and socialists also tend to deny the practical nature of politics, because while they provide an analysis to explain the occurrence of conflict, incompatible goals, they aspire to a situation in which no conflict would occur. Marxists aim for a conflict-free because classless society. Nationalists are confident that the people or nation, once allowed to rule itself, will be so unified that it will pursue its destiny without diverting from its chosen path. Anyone who might challenge this required unity is regarded thereby as disqualifying herself as a member of the nation or people or classless progressive society. The persistent blindness of Irish nationalists to the existence of a significant large population of unionists in Ulster, although a minority on the island, is evidence of this anti-political tendency in nationalism. The poverty of the language available to our societies for managing conflict reflects general disregard for fundamental issues about the goods to be achieved in human society. These are the issues about what we want, how we want to live, what quality of relationships we desire to have with each other. Our culture gives preeminence to the technical in many ways, but especially in our investment in knowledge. For the sake of what we might wish to do, to build and create, we invest a lot of effort in accumulating technical knowledge. This is primarily knowledge about materials, which enables us to exploit fossil fuels, wind and sun power, radioactive elements, optic fiber, microchip processors, and so on. But there is no comparable investment by our culture in accumulating practical knowledge. Pope Francis, in his letter Laudato Si, makes this point convincingly in terms of the dominance of the technocratic paradigm. To know what people want and to know what conflicted parties want would require a mastery of the languages in which people express their convictions and values. These include the languages of religious worldviews, in which people express their fundamental desires and their ultimate aspirations. A culture committed to managing conflict by political means would endeavor to be literate in what people want, what different groups want, and in their relevant histories. This requires complex hermeneutic skills, since we should expect it to be the case that people want many things, that their goals are diverse and often conflicted. Accordingly, it is not a matter of having an established agreed principle or set of principles specifying a highest good or most fundamental set of needs from which guidance and directives might be drawn. That would be the model of technical knowledge. Religious worldviews and religious languages. Good people wanting to do good things are in conflict with one another because the goals they pursue are incompatible. For instance, cabinet ministers seeking more resources for their departments are in conflict. More money for education means less for security or social welfare or health. Conflict occurs because of the richness of the human good, the creativity of human agents, and the limitations of time, energy, and material resources for them to realize their plans and objectives. Of course, conflict also occurs because of greed, hatred, and the desire to dominate others. That's Augustine's great phrase, the desire to dominate, and we will be attending to his view in next week's lecture. It is important that religious people, and Christians in particular, be free of the prejudice that conflict arises only from fault or sin on the part of some participants in the conflict. It is an important corrective for religious worldviews to accept that conflict can also arise from good people wanting to do good things. Just as there have been philosophical positions, such as those of Plato, Rousseau, or Marx, which have discounted conflict, so too there are theological accounts, often drawing on eschatological visions of God's kingdom, which regard conflict only in negative terms. Most religious visions with their associated ideals favor harmony, community, peace between the creator and creatures, between all humankind, all peoples and states, and between humans and the rest of creation. Christian rhetoric often appeals to values, ideals, and visions of the good, easily evoked by powerful symbols. Swords into plowshares, the heavenly banquet, the feeding of the multitude, the healing of the blind and lame. But these values and ideals cannot function as premises in arguments from which governments or other authorities can deduce suitable policy proposals. Christians must take care that their invoking of their ideals not distract from or frustrate the work of building viable proposals based on reliable practical knowledge of the issues. One danger is that religious language plays down, at least, or even denies the reality of actual conflict, stressing instead the aspiration to harmony and community, which it holds out as a promise. But the opposite danger is also linked to the use of religious language, namely that it exacerbates conflict and polarizes the parties. Religiously inspired languages can be problematic in the face of conflict. Instead of recognizing what is common to the conflicted parties, the language of faith can stress instead the divisions, the differences between the insiders and the others, the familiar pairs of Jew and Gentile, believer and infidel, Christian and non-Christian, convey this separation. Common to these examples is the use of terminology which originates within one worldview and which is used by sharers in that worldview to speak of those who are outside. If citizens wish to be political in the proper sense, they require an appropriate language for conflict in which parties in conflict can speak to each other and not simply speak about each other. To speak to and not simply about each other in a conflict situation requires a degree of communality, at least at the level of language. A shared language is required in which each in turn can have the status both of speaker and spoken to. It has to be a language that is rooted in a common humanity. Is there a common language in each of these cases in which we can speak across the division and not only about those on the other side? Secularists have long advocated their stance as providing the needed neutral ground, but the neutrality of that ground is suspect. Alistair MacIntyre, among many others, has highlighted the illusion and the danger that people of faith may have sold the pass in conversations simply by accepting the ideology of a neutral language. The politics of recognition and identity politics are built on the argument that the standard assumptions about the autonomous agent and the nature of practical rationality are not only not neutral, as they claim, but that they privilege one kind of identity and mode of experience, often that of the masculine, Western, adult individual. Is there a possible perspective rooted in a shared humanity which acknowledges the religious dimension of human experience and so does not entail abandonment of deeply held convictions, but enables a speaking to opponents and not merely about them? To ask these questions is not to fall into the trap of accepting that religious difference is the principal source of conflict. William Kavanagh identifies this danger. We do not have to adopt the thesis that conflict emanates primarily from religious difference in order to accept the propensity of faith movements to be divisive and to acknowledge the history of religious conflict, often violent in its expression. Note again that I am emphasizing my account of conflict points to incompatible goals and not to divergent comprehensive doctrines or worldviews. The joint declaration by Pope Francis and the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, Ahmed Al-Tayeb, when they met in Abu Dhabi in February 2019, exemplifies the willingness to so engage. Their joint statement, a document on human fraternity for world peace and living together, expresses a simple but sincere invitation to all persons who have faith in God and faith in human fraternity to unite and work together so that it may serve as a guide for future generations to advance a culture of mutual respect in the awareness of the great divine grace that makes all human beings brothers and sisters. My argument so far is to clarify some basic concepts: conflict as incompatible goals, and politics as one specific way of managing conflict by talking rather than by relying on force. I want to stress the centrality of conflict in social life. Good people wanting good things get in one another's way. I also point out how certain philosophical, political, and theological traditions attempt to deny the reality of conflict or to explain it away. We can't settle a labor dispute by telling people to love one another. On the other hand, I only mention here what I don't have time to elaborate on. While stressing the pervasiveness of conflict, I do not wish to endorse the views of theorists such as Chantal Mouffe, who encourage a confrontational and agonistic approach, decrying the uselessness of politics or negotiation. On their view, since the stronger force always prevails, the only rational stance is the adoption of the pathway that allows one to attain superior power. With Machiavelli, who contrasts the animal's varied ways of managing conflict, he compares the lion with the fox, and then, on the other hand, the human way of persuasion, which is talking, I resolutely hold to the commitment of reliance on talking as the human way to handle conflict. And so I move on now to the next point, which is to query how well, if at all, does the Catholic stance on common goods address the issue of conflict. Can the Catholic Church incorporate the political common good within its overall vision of the common good? Considering the notion of common good as mentioned in Gaudium et Spes, you'll recall the set of conditions which enables each one and each community to achieve their fulfillment, we can ask whether the structures and procedures of liberal democratic regimes within pluralist societies belong among those conditions which are the common good. Are those structures and procedures to be valued and respected and defended, even when they lead to outcomes on occasion which evidently are not for the common good? Plato used the metaphor of the ship to contrast democracy with good order to the detriment of democracy. On the one hand, he described the situation of the ship guided by a captain who knew his port of destination and mastered the relevant navigation skills in order to reach it. You'll recognize there that technical sense of rule mentioned above. On the other hand, there is the image of a motley crew in which there is no single voice commanding obedience, but each one on board has his own view of where the ship should go and how it should be brought there. The equality and freedom of each one also contributes to the problem. Note here, they are the democratic virtues, the values of equality and freedom. Liberal democratic systems of government in pluralist societies are vulnerable to the kind of polemic evident in Plato, the disorganized mob attempting to sail a ship. In the face of this polemic, it is difficult to make a case for a form of rule which is not based on an appeal to the ruler's unique knowledge, skill, or competence. But that is precisely what is required if we are to see the point of liberal democracy. There are plenty of persons or groups competing for power, claiming to have the relevant knowledge and competence. But there is no agreed criterion to decide which views are correct and who is entitled to rule. MacIntyre is correct in his analysis to this extent. The disintegration of a shared worldview and the absence of agreement regarding a hierarchy of goods made it impossible for someone to be recognized as entitled to rule due to superior knowledge. Contrary to the position taken by MacIntyre and other critics of liberal regimes, I want to argue that there is something truly valuable in the achievement of modern liberal politics. It represents the institutionalization of a distinctive and human way of managing social conflict. The management of conflict is political when it renounces a primary reliance on coercion or domination, when it attempts to achieve conciliation through negotiation, argument, and persuasion. This is not an argument in favor of liberal democracy based on any claim that democracy provides a way of reaching better, more rational, or more grounded decisions. It is simply a claim that the regimes with a commitment to handle conflict by talking mark a major step forward in human ordering of social life. These are political forms of rule, and the distinction allows us to remark that many nominally democratic regimes fail to be political insofar as they institutionalize the domination by the majority. Winner takes all attitudes operative in recent experiences illustrate this corruption of democracy. Although conflict usually entails disagreement, not every disagreement leads to conflict. Gaudium et Spes has many references to disagreement, but not so many to conflict. There are a couple of points where conflict is mentioned, but in such a way that the centrality of conflict to liberal democratic politics is overlooked. The document notes cases of conflict of interests, incompatible goals, when rulers place their own interests ahead of the common good, or when citizens pursue their own interests at the expense of the common good. The problem with these cases is the implicit assumption that there is an identifiable common good being jeopardized by pursuit of special interests. The normal case in liberal democratic politics is not considered, namely, where the challenge is to work out some way of managing the conflict between warranted interests and interest groups, where there is no way of knowing in advance which interests are more justified than others. These are the cases of conflict in which good people pursuing worthwhile objectives prevent each other from succeeding. As I've remarked already, the cabinet negotiations of any well-functioning democracy will involve competing demands for resources, for healthcare, for education, security, job creation, social welfare, defense. Conflict is at the heart of democratic politics. That is a conflict which is not simply due to moral fault or flaw, the inordinate pursuit of particular interests. And the common good is not available as an already known quantity to determine correct solutions. I persist with this question of knowing the common good, namely the concrete set of means and conditions that facilitate human flourishing. What we find in the modern appreciation of politics is an honest acknowledgement of the limits of our knowledge. We speak and write about what we don't yet know, and we admit the danger of being misled into thinking that because we can name something, we know it. Is this acknowledgement of ignorance sufficiently present in the church's approach to conflict? I suggest that our language can trap us into assuming that because we can name the common good, we or someone knows what it is. Thomas Aquinas defines law as a certain ordinance of reason for the common good made by the one who has care of the community and promulgated. Whoever has care of the community has responsibility for the common good. And in Thomas's world, this was a prince or a king, or in one case, an emperor. This phrase typically identifies the ruler in terms of his or her central responsibility, namely to care for the common good of the community. Function, not structure or constitution, is the key to understanding political authority in this tradition, a tradition from Aristotle via Aquinas. Whatever form the constitution of the political community may take, principality, kingdom, empire, city-state, republic, those with authority in the community have a responsibility to care for the common good. Inevitably, the predominance of monarchy or principality meant that the imagery for political authority was mostly of individuals exercising power. Plato's ideal of the philosopher king shaped Catholic notions of the responsibility of the prince in a culture in which the ruler was expected to know the good of his or her kingdom and pursue it. Augustine's framing of advice to Christian rulers on the model of the pater familias, the father of the family, head of the household, incorporates a similar image. The prince, king, or emperor is assumed to know what is needed for the common good, and so can make and promulgate reasonable directives for the common good. The great advantage of the Church's functional understanding of political authority is that it is applicable across a range of constitutions. As a result, revolutionary changes of regime did not require the Church to rethink her teaching. From her point of view, a post-revolutionary regime was as morally obliged as the older one it had replaced to serve the common good. Law should be reasonable and be directed to the common good, whether made by a monarch or a triumvirate or a parliament. The form of state or constitution was irrelevant. The function of political authority remained the same. But perhaps there was a hidden trap here. If something significantly different was emerging in the process of historical change, in the emergence of new democratic institutions predicated on liberty, then reliance on the assumption of continuity of function could blind the church teachers to the nature of what they addressed. If we accept that the whole citizen body now has charge of the common good in a democratic polity, along with the representatives and officers elected or appointed for particular functions, we must acknowledge that the common good which they seek is not and cannot be a prescribed set of policies derived from a notion of the best or highest good. This is John Rawls's challenge in political liberalism, that we accept the fact of reasonable pluralism as setting the context for politics. We must also accept that working out the actual set of projects which will constitute the society's common good will rarely, if ever, be conducted as a philosophy seminar, relying exclusively on reasoned argument, attempting to overcome disagreement, but will be the more or less satisfactory outcome of a contest of conflicting interests and a struggle for influence. Of course, Pope John Paul II is absolutely correct in insisting that democratic politics is not a way of determining what is true or right, but it is a way for parties in conflict to find some way of living together. This is the big difference between the political sense of conciliation and reconciliation in the theological sense. Pope Francis in Fratelli Tutti acknowledges the reality of conflict. He appeals to his readers, especially Christians, not to run away from conflict, but to engage in conflict in the hope of achieving a dialogue and a conciliation that avoids the destructiveness of violence. He has definitely moved the thinking of the Church beyond the ambivalence we have seen in the confusion of the notions of disagreement and conflict in the Vatican Council's Gaudium et Spes. At the same time, Francis invokes Benedict's placing of the dignity of the human person at the center of politics, along with the commitment to the common good. But here there persists the same difficulty of mentioning the common good as if it were a quantity or content or substantive already known. I conclude with a couple of his paragraphs from the letter Fratelli Tutti. The task of building social peace, he writes, requires us to place at the center of all political, social, and economic activity the human person who enjoys the highest dignity and respect for the common good. May this determination help us flee from the temptation for revenge and the satisfaction of short-term partisan interests. This is a quotation from a speech he made in Bolivia in 2017, where the challenge of building social peace is very real. In the letter, he also quotes John Paul II from Centesimus Annus to the effect that the Church does not intend to condemn every possible form of social conflict. The Church is well aware that in the course of history, conflicts of interest between different social groups inevitably arise, and that in the face of such conflicts, Christians must often take a position honestly and decisively. And finally, he acknowledges that peace can be achieved in conflict, and cites Pope Pius XI from Quadragesimo Anno, 1931, authentic reconciliation does not flee from conflict, but is achieved in conflict, resolving it through dialogue and open, honest, and patient negotiation. Conflict between different groups, if it abstains from enmities and mutual hatred, gradually changes into an honest discussion of differences founded on a desire for justice. In Gaudium et Spes, in paragraph 74, the term common good is said to be understood in the dynamic sense of the term. I suggest that this qualification is an acknowledgement that the search for the common good is ongoing. In other words, it admits that the core idea of the common good is heuristic, naming that which is being sought, but which is not yet known, although enough about it is known to be able to specify the program for its discovery. The criteria to be applied are by now familiar. First, no individuals or groups may be excluded from participation in enjoyment of the goods we pursue together. And second, no aspect of the human good may be systematically excluded from the common good. These criteria find expression in many of the Church's advocacy stances, as for instance in making the option for the poor, that's the first criterion, and in protecting the religious dimension in educational policies, the second criterion. Together, they are succinctly expressed in the theme of Populorum Progressio and Caritas in Veritate, concern for the development of every person and of the whole person. And so I conclude my lecture opened by citing Girard's question and reformulating it in my terms. How do we succeed when on rare occasions we actually do succeed in managing our conflicts such that they do not erupt in violence? How do we institutionalize the peaceful and peace-endorsing handling of conflict? Among the answers to this question must be, we institutionalize the peaceful handling of conflict by valuing politics as activity based on the commitment to handle conflict by talking, and by acknowledging that such activity and its institutions are among our common goods, namely, among the means and conditions for human flourishing. We institutionalize the peaceful handling of conflict by valuing every human person as a transcendent value, by valuing the persons of character who are willing to put themselves forward as political actors, by valuing the skills and virtues they require, and including these among the aims of our educational systems. We institutionalize the peaceful handling of conflict by valuing practical knowledge as much as we value technical knowledge, and fostering the development of related human and social sciences. To the extent that we don't do these things, we leave ourselves vulnerable to those who can promise to get things done, whatever it may cost. And if we are not always at one another's throats, it is because there are persons in place with character and virtue and appropriate skill and knowledge, supported by appropriate institutions to facilitate the handling of conflict. These common goods of persons, skills, knowledge, and institutions facilitate all our goods in common. The theme of conflict will link us again to next week's lecture on political Augustinianism. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Patrick, for your exploration of the concept of conflict, and very interestingly, your exploration also of the political aspects of such a concept and the implications for the broader discussion on good. Now, we have some time for questions, so please do continue to post your questions in the Q&A. And let me just begin by asking you about your category of function. So how does this point to a distinctive methodological approach to social and political reality?
Yes, thank you. I think it is a philosophical approach, isn't it, rather than coming from your field, which is political science, and you are interested as a political scientist in the structures and the institutions and the forms that political rule might take, whereas the focus on function we find in that tradition coming from Aristotle. It's a philosophical tradition that considers, well, what is the end that is being sought, that is intended, and then how is what we do helping us to achieve that end. And the end considered for Aristotle, it's the good life, the life in which all possible elements of human flourishing are achieved. What he's concerned about is finding the instruments and the ways that will bring about that good life, that good functioning for everyone. And that was what he considered to be the primary business of the legislators in the city, those who make the law. It is interesting in the way in which that has become a focus in the church in its approach to the method, to the questions of politics and of rule. Charles Curran, the theologian who has written a lot on Catholic social thought and the history of Catholic social thought, has remarked on a number of occasions that the church has no theory of the state. And of course, this is a point in which it has been criticized because it is naive sometimes in considering the state. But it is not naive philosophically in considering what are the functions of those who have authority within societies, however they are structured or organized. How can they be understood in terms of their responsibilities and their duties? And it is their function in caring for the common good, the good of all, that is the source of specification then for their responsibilities, for their authority also in making law to achieve the good functioning, the good flourishing of everyone.
Thank you, Patrick. Now we have a question from Mark Aloisius from London. Considering your rejection of an antagonistic or confrontational approach in managing conflict, would you then endorse the cultivation of friendship in politics for managing conflict? And how would you assess the role of friendship in politics?
Well, the notion of friendship is discussed by Aristotle and also Aquinas following him in different senses. There are different senses in which we are friends with people. We're always pursuing some good together. Friendship is some form of collaboration. Those who act together are pursuing some good. Sometimes the good at stake is simply pleasure, as when a group of friends meet to play cards or to play a game of tennis. It's for a good play of the game that the people get together. And another way of people being friends is for business purposes or for mutual benefit. You know, you look after me and I look after you. We do one another favors. And it's very good to have friends in high places or cultivate the old school tie, as we say. You have friends that you turn to for assistance. The full sense of friendship, according to Aristotle and then Aquinas, is the wanting the good that is the total well-being of the friend for the friend's own sake. And where two friends are engaged in a friendly relation with one another in that full sense, they really want each other to do well in all possible respects for their own sake, not for the benefit of oneself, but that the other do well for that other's sake. Now, political friendship, then Aristotle recognizes there has to be, it's part of what he makes as an essential characteristic of the city, that is a polis rather than simply a non-aggression pact or a set of treaties for exchange of goods and services or for the mutual guarantee of rights. The friendship involved in caring about the well-being, the character of the members of the city is what is the bond of friendship within the city. But it is not the same as intimate friendship. It can't be the same as intimate friendship because Aristotle knew we will only have a small number of friends with whom we can be that closely engaged. But there is something distinctive about political friendship, which is then wanting the good of the members of one's community for their own sake, that they do well. And how do we provide that kind of friendly care for each other? Well, we have articulated that in various ways by wishing for one another that our rights would be secured. That's a minimal negative approach, you might say. But then also willing and wishing that each of us would have access to those means and conditions that will enable us to flourish, among which we identify healthcare and education as fundamental provisions, the fostering of the character and skills and well-being of persons, that they are capable of participating in political community and social life. So there is, yeah, the possibility of respecting friendship as a core common good in political society without assuming that it is the same as the most intimate form of friendship or the most complete form of friendship. Of course, this is what Christian theology has built on by speaking of caritas, the bond of love that wills the good of others for their own sake, according to the plan that God has for them. Love one another as I have loved you. So we love our neighbor as ourselves because of that love that has first been received from God and communicated to us through Christ. And it is that vision of community bounded in love that is also echoing the Aristotelian philosophical understanding of a political community bounded in friendship. But of course, the friendship with God takes it beyond what is available to us or accessible to us as human beings, to something that is only there by virtue of God's gift and grace.
Thank you, Patrick. We have a question from Katie Higgins. Is conciliation possible where there is no parity of esteem between parties?
I turn that around. It's too easy to stand outside of situations and give a judgment on what is possible and what is not possible. I want to live in a society where we manage our conflicts by talking. That means I commit to being that kind of person who will, in the face of the absence of esteem or the absence of respect or mutuality of respect, will try to meet it by giving the respect that is not reciprocated, by modeling an approach that suggests I am continually making myself available to talk about this, to negotiate this on a basis of parity of respect. Now that makes one vulnerable, there's no doubt about that, but I don't see any way around it. I want to be living in societies that approach our conflict that way. And so while I might be tempted to give a commentator's answer to the question by saying, no, it's not possible, I'm not going to go that way because of my commitment to managing conflict by talking rather than by relying on any use of force. And sometimes what appears to be talking is actually use of force because it is bullying, it's browbeating, it's shouting down, it's manipulative.
Thanks, Patrick. Well, I have tried to summarize some of the questions. Many people are interested in the topic. So once again, thanks, Patrick, for this, for all the dedication in these lectures. On behalf of Campion Hall and our partners, Georgetown University Press, thank you all for joining us and for being with us this evening. Please remember to register for the next week's lecture at the same weekday, same time, for the fifth lecture, that's Augustinianism.
Yes.
We'll see each other once.
Good. Thank you very much indeed.